In a previous video, we discussed how you can create a custom window command and use that in a build system so that when you execute a build, your custom command gets executed instead of what Sublime would normally do while running a build. But what if you wanted to still do what Sublime would normally do, but take some extra actions as well? In this video, we cover a very simple way to do just that. Hello, fellow Sublime Text fanatics. ODAT Nerd here. Welcome to this video on simple build system custom targets. Before we get started, as always, if you're finding these videos helpful or useful in any way, please use the thumb and subscribe buttons you'll find below the video as you deem appropriate to the situation. And if you have any questions or comments on the content of this video, any of the videos on the channel, or suggestions for other topics you'd like me to cover, drop those down in the comment section below or hit me on Twitter at ODATNerd. Now, the thing we were going to be talking about here is simplified custom build targets. Now, in particular, as we said in the introduction, you generally, when you create a custom build target, you still want to execute some sort of external program. You just want to do extra work in there before the build happens, or maybe even after the build happens. And as it turns out, it's actually pretty easy to do that by just leveraging the fact that Sublime already has a command that you can use to execute build systems. It's the one that it would have used by default. So in order to demonstrate that, let's pretend that we want to create a build system which prompts the user and asks them if they want to actually proceed with the build before the build actually happens. So the first thing we need to do is create the custom target command. And again, as always, we can go here and say new plugin. And of course, again, I added this to my command palette. So you can go to Tools, Developer, New Plugin if you haven't added this to your command palette. And we get the stub sample plugin. Now I'm going to go ahead and paste in this code that I pre-wrote. And we're just going to save this as confirm exec.py, like so. Now, this is a very simple thing. So let's just quickly go over the 4 lines of code that we see here. As always, if we're going to create a custom build target, we're going to have to define a command that is a window command, because window commands are the only ones that you can use for a custom target. And every command has a run method that runs when the command executes. And we are again using the ** kwargs Pythonism to tell Python we'll take any and all arguments, just provide them to us as a dictionary. Now, the line on line 7 here is going to use a Sublime API endpoint called yes, no, cancel dialog, which shows the text that you pass as the first argument and then asks you to click yes, no, or cancel, the return value telling you which. And if you say yes, then what we're going to do is ask our window to please run the exec command and pass to it the arguments that we were given. Now, keep in mind, remember that the exec command is actually the one that Sublime would have invoked or does invoke when you create a build if you don't use a custom target. So here we are able to run our own code and then just get it to run the command it would have run anyway. And then to tie that into our build, we have to go into our build system and add a target key. So we would jump over to tinycc.sublime build, and remember we have to provide a key named target, and the command that the value of this is the name of the command to execute, and that is confirm exec, like so. So now we can save that. Now when we come back to hello.c, when I push the build key, which again is Control B on Windows and Linux and Command B on macOS, we get it asking us this question: do you want to run the build? And I can say no, and then nothing happens. The build has been canceled. And if I run the build again, I can say yes, and now we see the build actually happening. It says hello world. So this is by far the simplest thing you could do to create a build system and have it do some sort of work ahead of time and then just execute the build the way the build would have been executed otherwise. Now, as simplistic and contrived examples go, this is pretty top notch, but also, when you're doing something like this, usually the code that you want to execute before the build executes is something a little more complex than asking the user if they actually meant to press the key that they actually pressed. So here's something else that you might want to do, and we covered this very briefly in the video on custom build targets. So go back to that video if you haven't watched it yet, or you need a refresher. But what we can actually do is add some extra code in here, such as again this code that I wrote here. Now remember, you can in a Sublime build file, if you're using a custom target, add any keys that you want, and they'll just be passed to you as arguments. So in this example, on line 7, we are asking for the value of the caption argument and giving it a default value if it's not provided in the build. And then we, on lines 9 and 10, we do something that you is generally one of the reasons why, or that I've seen that people want to do something like this. They want to be able to add their own variables to expand things out. And so an example of that would be here. We say on line 9, we ask the window to extract variables. Now, what that gives you is a dictionary that has as keys all of those variables that you can normally provide in a build system: the name of the file, the name of the path, all of that sort of stuff. See the linked documentation for the full list of all of those variables, but that line grabs those out into a dictionary and returns it back to you. And then on line 10, we use an API endpoint in Sublime called expand variables, where you pass it a value and you pass it a list of variables, and it expands all of the variables in there for you and returns back a value. So once all that is said and done, we will have expanded variables in the string caption. Now we can come over here to this code and replace this with the text caption, which is the variable that we just created, and save the plugin. Now when I come back here, when I push the build key, we'll see that nothing has changed. It's still saying run the build as it did previously. But now with the code in our plugin, we are able to use the name of a variable key in here to be able to say what we want the caption to be. So we might say do it instead and add a thing and save the build. Now remember, that key, because I'm using package dev, is highlighted differently because it's not one of the standard keys that exec knows how to handle. So the package dev highlights its value differently. So what do we think happens when I come over here and hit build? Again, if we look at the code, we are grabbing the value of the caption variable. We are expanding any variables in it, which currently there are none. And then we're passing it to the yes, no, cancel dialog. So whatever we put in the caption field, which here is do it, should be what the dialog box asks us. So let's see what happens. We see it working. It's now using the message from the build. It's saying do it. So I'm going to say I want to build, and oh, we're getting a weird error message here. And if I scroll up, we can see the error is init got an unexpected keyword argument caption. And the reason for that is, if you'll recall, when we execute a custom build like this, all of the keys in the build will be passed as argument, except for the ones that Sublime uses to determine how the build should be executed, like the selector and the target and those sorts of things. And they are passed to our command, and we're passing them on line 13 directly to the exec command. However, the exec command doesn't have an argument named caption, and it gets very angry about that. But fortunately, the fix on that is very simplistic. Instead of using get, use pop instead, which asks for the value and then removes it from the dictionary. And now when we come over here, we can use the build key again. It again asks us do it, and when we hit the key, it says hello world and finished. So we have now successfully done that. Now the code in our thing here is expanding variables, but we haven't actually seen that in play yet. So what we could actually do, and what you would probably do if you were doing something like this, is you wouldn't want this message to say do it. You would want it to say build $file, for example, like so, so that it's asking you, do you want to build this file? Now, remember, as I said in the video on custom build targets originally, $file won't be expanded by Sublime in the caption argument here because it's not one of the keys that exec normally gets. So that would just be skipped over. But the code in our plugin on lines 9 and 10 is going out of its way to expand that variable, all variables in there for us. So when we come back over to our hello.c and run the build, it asks if we want to build hello.c from the file on my desktop, and I can say yes. Now there's one last thing I'd like to point out here. If we go into the Tools menu, you can see under the Build and Build With, there is a value there called Cancel Build, which is currently grayed out because there's not a build running, one would presume. So if I was to uncomment this line to make this code sleep for 20 seconds so that it prints hello world and then waits 20 seconds before it finishes, we might see that we say we want to do the build, and we go into the Tools menu, cancel build is still grayed out. We can't actually cancel this build here. And the reason for that is because we have specified the target key here. We've told Sublime, instead of doing what you normally do to run a build, run my command. And Sublime graciously does that. But because it's not doing what it would have normally done to execute the build, it doesn't know how it could actually cancel the build. Because it doesn't know how it got started in the first place. It just knows confirm exec is the command that it executed to do that. How can we solve this problem? That is the topic for another video. So there we have it, some fairly simplistic code, a very simple way to execute a custom build and still have exec, the internal command, run the build for you. Now with this, you could take any action you want prior to executing the actual build itself. And we saw a couple examples of what you might want to do here, implementing your own variables and taking control of the build that way. In the next video, we'll talk about solving that problem we just talked about, how to cancel a running build if you've started it with a custom target. Before we go, as it's a quick reminder, if you're finding these videos helpful or useful, you can thumb and subscribe in those buttons down below. Leave comments down below or on Twitter if you have any questions or comments or suggestions for videos. But until that next video with the critical topic of build cancellation, this is ODAT Nerd asking you to please have a sublime day.